They told you the Old Testament was the unshakable word of God, a perfect record of history and divine truth written down as it happened. But what if I told you that the book sitting on your shelf, the book that millions have sworn their lives upon, is not what you think it is and never was what they told you it was, and the proof is hiding in plain sight, waiting for anyone brave enough to see it, but most will never look because they are afraid of what they might find. And here is the first shock you must face. The Old Testament was never one single book, never one continuous story from a single voice, but rather a patchwork quilt of conflicting traditions, rival priests, and political agendas stitched together over centuries by people who were not eyewitnesses to the events they described. And this is not conspiracy theory, this is established history among scholars, yet it is conveniently ignored in Sunday sermons because telling you that the sacred text was edited, rewritten, and combined from multiple sources would shatter the illusion that it dropped from heaven in perfect form. And if that illusion shatters, the control built upon it collapses, so they keep the silence. But today, you will not have that silence. You will have the truth, and it begins with something called the documentary hypothesis, an unassuming academic term that hides an explosive reality because it reveals that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, the very heart of Jewish and Christian faith, were not written by Moses as tradition claims, but are instead the result of at least 4 separate authors or schools of thought, known to scholars as J, E, P, and D, each with their own theology, vocabulary, and political motives. And when you read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy carefully, you see the seams where these versions were woven together. You see stories told twice in different ways, laws repeated with variations, even names for God changing, abruptly mid-story. And this is not the fingerprint of a perfect divine mind. It is the fingerprint of human editing, messy, inconsistent, and politically charged. And here is the uncomfortable question. If God dictated the Old Testament perfectly, why would he need to tell the same story in 2 contradictory ways, sometimes within the same chapter? And why would he change his own name mid-conversation, unless what you are reading is not one voice, but a chorus of competing voices that later generations pretended were one? And once you understand this, you cannot unsee it, because Genesis itself starts with 2 creation stories, not one. The first in Genesis chapter 1 and the second in Genesis chapter 2, and they do not agree on the order of events. One has plants created before man, the other has man created before plants. One calls the creator Elohim, the other calls him Yahweh. And these are not small differences, they are cracks in the foundation, evidence that you are looking at stitched together traditions from different regions of ancient Israel. And the reason for this is that ancient Israel was not a unified kingdom of perfect theological agreement. It was a patchwork of tribes with different beliefs, different sacred stories, and even different names for God. And when political necessity arose, particularly during the time of the monarchy, these stories were merged into a single official version to unite the people under one national religion. But in doing so, contradictions were inevitable. Yet rather than eliminate them, the editors kept both, possibly out of respect for tradition, or perhaps because each had powerful backers who refused to let their version die. And so you ended up with a book where God's character shifts like a mirror, reflecting whoever happens to be writing him at the moment. Sometimes loving and merciful, sometimes genocidal and wrathful, sometimes invisible and distant, sometimes walking in the garden like a man. And no preacher will tell you this because the illusion of a consistent God is central to religious authority. But history shows us that the text itself destroys that illusion if you read without the blinders they give you. And let us be clear here. The people who assembled the Old Testament were not trying to lie in the way you think of lying. They were doing what rulers and priests have done for thousands of years, using the stories and beliefs of the people to create unity, legitimacy, and control. And in ancient times, divine authority was the most powerful tool of all. So if a king could say his laws were not his own but the laws of God, he could demand absolute obedience. And the Old Testament in its earliest form was as much a political constitution as it was a collection of spiritual stories. But over centuries, the political origins were forgotten by the common people, replaced by the belief that the book had been written in a single burst of divine inspiration, and that belief is the one that has been handed down to you. But I am here to rip back the curtain, because the truth is that the earliest Hebrew scriptures were oral traditions, stories told and retold, altered each time they were spoken, shaped by the needs of the moment, and only written down much later, often in times of national crisis when preserving identity mattered more than factual accuracy. And when those oral traditions were finally committed to writing, they were far from complete. They were copied, edited, and re-edited over generations, sometimes to add new laws, sometimes to add new prophecies, sometimes to make sense of national disasters by retroactively blaming the people's sin. And once you realize this, the Old Testament stops being a timeless window into the mind of God and starts looking like a constantly evolving national epic, one that reflects the shifting fears, ambitions, and politics of the people who preserved it. And I know this is hard to hear, because for many of you, this book was the anchor of your moral and spiritual life. But think about this. If your faith can only survive by ignoring history, is it faith or is it conditioning? And if God truly wanted to communicate perfectly, why would he do it through centuries of oral tradition, editing, and redaction, leaving us with a text so full of human fingerprints that its divine origin becomes impossible to verify? And here is the most devastating part. You can prove all of this without ever leaving the Bible itself, because the inconsistencies, the double narratives, the abrupt changes in style and theology, they are all still there in the text you own, right now, in your home, waiting for you to notice. And if the very foundation of your belief system is built on a book whose origin story is not what you were told, then everything that rests on that foundation must be re-examined, not to destroy your faith, but to set it free from the control of those who have used half-truths to keep you obedient. And once you have seen the seams in the tapestry, you cannot go back to pretending it is seamless, because now you know that the Old Testament you hold in your hands is not the pure, unaltered voice of God. It is the record of a people, edited by priests, influenced by politics and shaped by centuries of human intervention. And in the next part, I will show you that even the supposedly pure Hebrew origins of the Old Testament are not what you think, because deep in its most famous stories lie the fingerprints of pagan civilizations long before Israel ever existed, and those fingerprints change everything about what you thought you knew about this book. You have been told that the Old Testament was born in isolation, the unique revelation of one people chosen by God to be set apart from all others. But the moment you look beneath the surface, that story crumbles, because the DNA of the Old Testament is not purely Hebrew at all. It is soaked in the culture, myths, and laws of civilizations that existed long before the nation of Israel, and you can trace the fingerprints of those civilizations through some of the most famous and supposedly original passages of the Bible. And here is where the shock becomes almost unbearable. Many of the stories you thought originated in the Old Testament were told centuries earlier in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan, sometimes with details so close it is impossible to believe they were not borrowed, reworked, and baptized as Israel's own history. And the most glaring example is the flood story, which many Christians and Jews have been taught to see as unique, yet the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian tale that predates the Hebrew Bible by hundreds of years, contains a flood narrative with uncanny similarities, a divine decision to destroy humanity, a chosen man warned to build a massive boat, the gathering of animals, the survival of the chosen few, and the release of birds to see if the waters had receded. And the parallels are not coincidental. They are evidence of cultural transmission, because the Israelites were not living in a vacuum. They were part of a region in constant exchange of ideas, stories, and religious concepts. And this becomes even clearer when you realize that the creation story in Genesis echoes older Mesopotamian myths like the Enuma Elish, where a god creates order out of chaotic waters, separating heaven from earth, setting celestial bodies in place, and even resting after the work is done. And this is not blasphemy. This is history, because in the ancient Near East, every culture borrowed from the ones before and around it. But here is the critical point. The Old Testament was presented to you as if it was completely original, as if God whispered it directly to his chosen scribes without any contamination from human culture. Yet the evidence shows that the very foundation stories were part of a much older and broader mythological tradition. And if that is true, then either God decided to recycle pagan myths for his ultimate revelation, or the Old Testament's authors did exactly what other ancient peoples did. They adapted the powerful stories of their neighbors to fit their own worldview, giving them new names and new theological twists. And this is where the exile in Babylon becomes central, because when Jerusalem fell and the elites of Judah were taken captive, they found themselves surrounded by the sophistication and deep history of Mesopotamian religion. And it is during or shortly after this period that much of the Old Testament as we know it was compiled, edited, and finalized, which is why Babylonian influence is embedded so deeply in its pages. From the flood to the Tower of Babel, from the creation order to legal codes, and speaking of legal codes, the famous laws of Moses in Exodus and Deuteronomy bear striking resemblance to the Code of Hammurabi, a Babylonian law code written centuries earlier, complete with laws about property, theft, slavery, and retribution that mirror the so-called divinely given commandments of Israel. And if God was revealing his perfect law for the first time, why would it look so much like the civil code of a pagan king? Unless the truth is that the Israelite scribes were drawing from the legal traditions they already knew, adapting them to their own narrative of divine origin, because divine authority gave those laws more power than any human king could. And once again, you see how the line between revelation and adaptation blurs, until it is almost impossible to separate them. And here is something even more unsettling. Many of the Psalms, which are often read as pure Hebrew poetry, carry stylistic and thematic elements found in Egyptian and Canaanite hymns, praising deities for their power over chaos, for their role in creation, and for their triumph over enemies. And when you compare them side by side, you can see the linguistic echoes, the imagery recycled, the theological shifts that take a hymn to a Canaanite god and reframe it as praise to Yahweh, which means the Old Testament is not a hermetically sealed vault of God's words, but a living, evolving library, shaped by centuries of cultural cross-pollination. And if you still think this does not matter, ask yourself this: if the book that defines the boundaries of your faith is built from the myths and laws of civilizations your religion calls pagan, then what does it mean to call it the ultimate truth? And if God allowed his supposed pure revelation to be formed out of the recycled ideas of other gods, then either those gods were real in some way, or the stories were never purely divine to begin with. And in both cases, the neat Sunday school picture of the Old Testament falls apart. And this realization is not meant to strip away your faith, but to force you to confront the reality that faith based on an illusion is not faith at all. It is trust in a story that has been carefully curated to hide its origins. And once you know that, you are faced with a choice. Do you cling to the comforting version you were told, or do you follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it takes you beyond the borders of the faith you inherited? And here is why this matters so much. If the Old Testament's origins are not purely divine, but are instead the result of centuries of human borrowing, editing, and political adaptation, then the authority it has been given over your life, its power to dictate morality, identity, and even your sense of who God is, was not handed down from heaven, but constructed on earth by people for reasons that were as much about survival and power as they were about spiritual truth. And in the next part, I will take you into that very heart of power to show you how the Old Testament was not just influenced by other cultures, but actively edited and reshaped by kings, priests, and political leaders to serve their own agendas. And once you see that, the question will no longer be whether the Old Testament is what you think. It will be how much of what you believe has been shaped by men you have never met, men who claimed to speak for God but were really speaking for the throne. If the foreign fingerprints on the Old Testament shake your confidence, what you are about to see will crush the idea that this book is an untouched, divinely dictated document, because even after it absorbed myths and laws from surrounding civilizations, the Old Testament underwent deliberate political reshaping, not by anonymous scribes copying faithfully, but by powerful leaders with very specific agendas. And the clearest example is King Josiah, a reformer king of Judah in the 7th century before the time of Christ, whose reign is remembered for a supposed discovery of the Book of the Law in the temple. But ask yourself, how does a nation that is supposedly built entirely on this divine law somehow lose it for generations, only to conveniently rediscover it during the reign of a king determined to centralize power and religious authority in Jerusalem? And what does it say that this discovered book, widely believed by scholars to be an early form of Deuteronomy, just happens to support Josiah's reforms in exact detail, including the centralization of worship in the temple he controls and the condemnation of all other local shrines? which also conveniently weakens the influence of priests outside his jurisdiction. And when you realize this, the whole scene looks less like a miraculous recovery of ancient scripture and more like the unveiling of a politically tailored document, one designed to give divine legitimacy to the king's program. And this is not an isolated case, because throughout the Old Testament, you can see laws, narratives, and even prophecies that align so perfectly with the needs of the ruling elite that it becomes hard to believe they were not edited or inserted for that purpose. And consider the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, where victories are framed as proof of God's blessing on obedience to the covenant and defeats as punishment for disobedience, a simple formula that gives rulers divine cover for any military campaign, because if the nation wins, the king can claim God is pleased with his leadership, and if it loses, he can blame the people for their sins, thereby shifting responsibility away from his own strategy. And the prophets, often imagined as independent voices of God, are not immune to political entanglement either, because while some genuinely challenged kings, others conveniently reinforced royal policies, and in the process, the prophetic tradition itself became part of the machinery of national control. And we cannot forget the post-exilic period, when the Persians allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, because it is during this time that much of the Old Testament was edited into its final form. And the Persians had no problem with the Jews worshipping their God, as long as it promoted loyalty and stability in the empire, so codifying a version of Israel's history and law that reinforced identity without encouraging rebellion was politically useful. And once you see this, the Old Testament starts to read like a constantly updated constitution of a theocratic state, one that could be amended when power shifted. And what is more, some of the so-called prophecies begin to look suspiciously like retroactive justifications, written after events happened but framed as if they had been predicted beforehand, which not only strengthens the authority of the text, but also cements the idea that God's hand is guiding the nation's destiny. And this pattern is ancient political propaganda at its finest. Wrap your agenda in the language of divine command, and the people will obey, not because they fear you, but because they fear disobeying God. And you can see the human fingerprints in the way laws evolve over time. Compare the covenant code in Exodus with the Deuteronomic code, and then with the priestly laws in Leviticus, and you will notice that they do not just repeat each other, they modify, expand, and sometimes contradict, reflecting shifting priorities, growing priestly influence, and the need to adapt to new circumstances. And if God gave his perfect law once, why would it need to be changed, updated, or reinterpreted to fit the politics of the moment, unless it was never purely divine law in the first place, but rather the ever-changing product of human governance disguised in sacred language? And this brings us to one of the most revealing aspects of the Old Testament's political edits, the portrayal of Israel's enemies, because these portrayals are not neutral. They demonize rival nations, justify conquests, and sanctify mass killings as the will of God, turning war into holy war. And when you realize that these texts were preserved and promoted by the victors, it becomes clear that the Old Testament, like all national histories, was written from the perspective of those in power, those who wanted to ensure that their enemies were remembered as evil and that their own victories were framed as acts of divine justice. And, yet in rare cases, you can catch glimpses of older traditions that tell a more complicated story, where Israel is not always the righteous hero, but those moments are buried under layers of editorial rewriting that smooth the narrative into one of moral superiority and divine favoritism. And this is why the Old Testament, for all its spiritual significance, is also one of the most politically useful documents in history. It offers a complete ideological system in which political loyalty and religious obedience are one and the same, and for the rulers of ancient Israel that was the ultimate form of control, because when your authority is indistinguishable from God's authority, any challenge to your rule becomes rebellion against heaven itself. And if you think this is only a problem of ancient history, think again, because the same model has been used in countless nations and religions since, blending politics and faith until they are impossible to separate. And the Old Testament is one of the earliest and most successful examples of that blend. So the next time you hear someone describe it as the unfiltered voice of God, remember King Josiah's reforms, remember the retroactive prophecies, remember the evolving laws, and ask yourself, if what you are seeing is divine revelation or masterful statecraft. And in the next part, we will push even deeper into the text itself, not from the outside looking in, but from within its pages, exposing the contradictions and inconsistencies that the editors could not erase, because these cracks in the narrative are the undeniable evidence that the Old Testament is not a seamless work of divine perfection, but a composite of competing voices stitched together under the banner of one God, yet unable to hide the fact that it is the work of many human hands. You can argue about historical influences and political edits all day, but nothing exposes the human fingerprints on the Old Testament more brutally than the contradictions that sit right there in the text itself, untouched, unhidden, daring you to notice them. And the truth is, most people never do, because they read the Bible in fragments, in sermons or daily devotionals, where a verse is plucked from one place and another from somewhere else, leaving you with the illusion of a seamless narrative. But the moment you read it continuously, chapter after chapter, the cracks split wide open, and the first and most famous example is right at the very beginning in Genesis, where there are two creation accounts, not one, with two completely different sequences of events, two different portrayals of God, and two different theological emphases. The first in Genesis chapter 1, showing a cosmic, distant creator who speaks the universe into existence in a carefully ordered sequence, ending with humans, male and female, created together. And the second in Genesis chapter 2, showing a hands-on anthropomorphic deity who forms man first from the dust, then plants a garden, then creates animals, and only afterward forms woman from the man's rib. And these accounts do not align chronologically or theologically, yet they are placed back to back as if no one will notice. But that is just the start, because the contradictions continue into the story of Noah's Ark, where in one place Noah is told to take 2 of every animal, and in another he is told to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean, and in one version the flood lasts 40 days. In another, it lasts 150, with different sequences of when the waters recede and which birds are sent out. And if God was dictating this perfectly, why would he give 2 different instructions for the same event, unless you are looking at 2 different traditions merged by an editor who chose to keep both? And the same happens in the 10 Commandments, which most people think of as a single unchanging set of divine rules written on stone by the very hand of God. Yet Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5 list them differently, with variations in wording, emphasis, and even order. And to make it stranger, Exodus chapter 34 presents an entirely different set of commandments altogether, labeled explicitly as the 10 Commandments, dealing mostly with ritual laws rather than moral ones. Yet this version is almost never preached in churches, because it would raise too many questions about which 10 Commandments are actually the real ones. And the contradictions are not just in laws and stories, they are in the very nature of God as presented, because in some passages God is all-knowing, able to see the end from the beginning, and in others he is caught off guard, surprised by human actions, even changing his mind in response to persuasion, as when Moses convinces him not to destroy Israel after the golden calf incident. And in some places God is said to never lie or change, while in others he sends lying spirits or reverses his decisions. And then there is the matter of who actually incited King David to take the census of Israel, because in 2 Samuel 24 it says God did it, but in 1 Chronicles 21 it says Satan did. And these are not minor details, they are direct contradictions in the attribution of an event. And once you see them, you start to realize that the Old Testament is less a single divine voice and more a patchwork of voices, sometimes agreeing, sometimes contradicting, each carrying its own agenda. And the editors who stitched them together either did not care to smooth them out or deliberately left them, perhaps because each had a constituency that would have rejected the text without their version included. And the genealogies are another giveaway, with names and numbers that do not match between different books, even when they are supposedly recounting the same lineage. And when it comes to historical events, the same battle can have entirely different casualty counts or outcomes depending on the source. Yet we are told this is all the perfect, infallible Word of God. And here is the question that cannot be avoided. If a book contains mutually exclusive statements, can both be the literal truth, or must we accept that one or both accounts were written from a human perspective, limited by human knowledge, memory, or bias, and once you accept that, the claim of divine perfection begins to collapse because perfection does not contradict itself, and yet the Old Testament does so repeatedly. And this matters because it forces you to confront the way you have been taught to read the Bible, where contradictions are explained away with clever harmonizations that often require mental gymnastics, turning plain words into coded allegories just to maintain the illusion of unity. But when you let the text speak for itself without forcing it into a predetermined mold, it tells you plainly that it is the work of many authors over many centuries, sometimes preserving conflicting traditions side by side. And once you see that, you have to ask, if God wanted us to have an unambiguous message, why deliver it in such a fragmented and contradictory form, unless the real goal was never perfect clarity, but the preservation of a national story, warts and all, that could be shaped and reshaped as needed by the leaders who controlled it. And this is why the contradictions are so important, because they are the seams in the garment, the proof that it has been sewn together from different pieces. And in the next and final block, we are going to step back and look at what all this means for you. Because once you understand that the Old Testament is a human construction influenced by foreign myths, shaped by politics, and riddled with contradictions, the question is no longer whether it is what you think. It is whether you are willing to let go of the version you were given and face the unsettling freedom of seeing it for what it truly is. By now you have seen that the Old Testament is not the perfect, untouched divine manuscript you were told it was. You have seen the foreign myths embedded in its foundation, the political hands that shaped its laws and narratives, and the contradictions that betray its human assembly. But the question that should haunt you now is this: if all of that is true, why has this book continued to hold such immense power over billions of people for thousands of years? And the answer is as unsettling as it is undeniable. It was never just about telling a story. It was about shaping a people, controlling a population, and creating a psychological framework so deeply ingrained that even when you see the flaws in the structure, you hesitate to step outside of it. Because the Old Testament does not simply tell you who God is, it tells you who you are allowed to be, and it does this with a mix of identity, fear, and reward that is as effective today as it was in the ancient world, starting with the concept of being the chosen people, a status that elevates the group above all others, while simultaneously binding them to an endless list of laws and obligations. And this dual identity, special but perpetually at risk of divine punishment, creates a constant psychological tension that keeps the faithful obedient, because you are told that every blessing in your life comes from obedience to the covenant and every curse from disobedience, and the fear of losing God's favor becomes a powerful motivator to conform, not just to divine rules, but to the leaders who claim to interpret and enforce them. And this is where the brilliance of the Old Testament structure becomes clear, because it fuses religious devotion with political loyalty so tightly that to question one is to risk betraying the other. And this is reinforced through stories that model absolute obedience, like Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, where the highest virtue is portrayed as unquestioning submission to a command that appears morally abhorrent, conditioning the reader to accept that God's will may override their own conscience. And when you accept that, you are vulnerable to anyone who can convincingly speak in God's name, and the laws themselves are another layer of control, covering every aspect of life: what you eat, what you wear, who you marry, how you worship, even how you rest. And these laws are not merely personal guidelines, they are communal obligations, enforced by social pressure and, in ancient times, by severe punishments, ensuring that the group remains uniform in practice and belief. And when you live under such a system, the boundaries of acceptable thought and behavior are set not by your own reasoning, but by the authority of the text and its interpreters. And the genius of this system is that it builds self-policing into the community, so that even without a king's soldiers watching you, your neighbors, your family, and even your own conscience act as enforcers of the law. And over time, this conditioning becomes so deep that you do not just fear divine punishment, you fear the loss of identity, the rupture of belonging, and the collapse of the moral framework you were taught is the only valid one. And that is why, even when confronted with evidence of the Old Testament's human origins, many people cannot let go, because the book is not just a set of stories to them, it is the map of reality itself, and to question it feels like stepping into chaos. But here is the truth that is both terrifying and liberating. Stepping into that chaos is the only way to see the world as it is, not as it was dictated to you, because the Old Testament, for all its historical and cultural value, is a product of human minds, shaped by human fears, ambitions, and power struggles. And once you know that, you can begin to separate the wisdom it contains from the chains it was designed to forge. You can appreciate the depth of its poetry, the richness of its narratives, and the lessons of its history without surrendering your autonomy to its every command. And you can recognize that morality does not need to be handed down from a flawed ancient text to be real. It can emerge from reason, compassion, and the shared human experience. But the first step toward that freedom is the hardest, admitting that what you were taught about the Old Testament was never the full truth, and that those who passed it down to you, whether knowingly or not, were part of a chain, stretching back to the very people who used it to control the lives of an ancient nation. And if you have made it this far, you are already breaking that chain. You are already stepping beyond the fear and into the possibility of something truer, something that is not bound by the edicts of kings or the myths of neighboring empires, something that belongs to you. And if you want to keep pulling back the curtain on the stories, doctrines, and institutions that have shaped your life without your consent, then you must stay with me, because this is only the beginning, and together we can uncover the rest of what they never wanted you to know. So subscribe now and do not miss what comes next, because the deeper we go, the more you will see that the Old Testament is not what you think, and once you see that, you can never see it the same way again.